So, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I hope you can hear me well. I'm Marta Tuninetti from Politecnico di Torino, and today I have the pleasure to moderate this dialogue around the water challenges and some solutions. So, first of all, I want to acknowledge Biennale Tecnologia 2026 and Politecnico di Torino for giving us the opportunity of discussing such a pressing challenge about water resources. And I also want to acknowledge l'Accademia delle Scienze di Torino for hosting us in this beautiful room, Sala dei Mappamondi. So I'm here with two guests who came here from abroad. Thank you for joining us in person. So we have here with us Wang-Erlandsson. She's an associate professor at Stockholm Resilience Center, where she co-leads the Anthropocene Dynamics research team and co-coordinates the Planetary Boundaries and Water Resilience Research Group. Her research focuses on large-scale land-water climate interactions and their implication for socio-ecological and earth system resilience. Thank you, Lan, for joining us. Then we have Monica Scatasta. She is the head of the Regional Development Division at the European Investment Bank, a center of expertise on cohesion policies, just transition, and disaster risk management, coordinating the related action plan of the European Investment Bank Group. She previously headed the Environment, Climate, and Social Affairs Office and Water and Waste Management Division at the European Investment Bank. Thank you, Monica, for joining us. So we start about discussing about the current issue of water resources by bringing and sharing with you some of the latest concept that has been introduced by the UN, and in particular by the Stockholm Water Prize Professor Madani, about the concept of water bankruptcy. So this idea that basically the current water system is in a situation where water use is happening on a scale, on a rate that is much faster than natural renewability. So basically the point of this Stockholm Water Prize professor is that the term water use, stress, scarcity, and even crisis are no more useful to describe our current situation, while we have entered in a post-crisis era. So where we can think about a financial analogy, where basically our water asset is given by a sum of the checking account, which is our surface water bodies, so the rivers, the lakes, and saving accounts that are our groundwater bodies, so the aquifers. And basically what they report in this UN report is that the current situation is that of a bankruptcy. So today we are going to discuss basically what are the needs of our policy agenda, what are the needs of science, of finance, in order to cope with this new situation. And in doing so, thinking also that around 35% of the natural wetlands have been lost since 1970. Then 4 billion people live in a situation of water stress for at least 1 month per year, and that the drought impacts cost to government more than $300 billion per year. So having said that, I want to start discussing with Lan about the issue of managing water under this bankruptcy situation, because this basically requires kind of a completely different approach, an approach that needs to be more systemic, cross-boundary, and resilience-oriented, hopefully. So Lan, tell us more about your vision and what we can do to basically describe and address this situation.
Thank you. And I think the key term here, yeah, is it okay? Okay. So the key term here really is system, or the system dynamics. So when we talk about resources and bankruptcy, they are great for describing the state that we are in, but they don't tell us why we ended up in this dire state, or what we can do about this. So when we think of water, water is not just an resource, but it's also part of a complex adaptive system that has its dynamics, feedbacks, and co-evolutionary dynamics across time and scale. So you have water changes within a river, but also in a river basin, but also across river basins and across continental scale through the atmospheric moisture transport and up to the Earth system scale when we also change, say, the carbon balance or albedo of ecosystems as water changes. This also means that we connect sectors across society. So water is never only water. So this means that when we think about conventional or traditional water resources management that is solely focusing water, they are not enough. They are great, but not enough to solve the issues that we face today. And that's why also we need a paradigm shift in thinking about water resilience and building water resilience that can cope with change, withstand disturbances, to adapt and to transform in face of this new playing field. The system dynamics and system complexity also means that we are not in control. It's not a machine, and we are not drivers in a car. I think a better metaphor could be like a sailor on the high seas. You have uncertainties and you have constant change that you need to navigate. So rather than control, we are more in a situation where we need to learn how to navigate. And for every sailor, the sailor needs to understand how the system that they're operating in works. And that comes into that we need to understand that certain features of the water problems, it's very important to understand how these features of water problems or water resilience loss look like when we try to then navigate this new situation. I will list 5 very important and interrelated, interacting features of water resilience loss that we've seen in research. I call them delay, redistribution, intertwinement, permanence, and scale, which conveniently can abbreviate it as DRIPS. So the first letter, D, referring to delay, basically means that there is a time delay between when something happens and when we actually see the impact being manifested. This could be because the impact only manifests in certain situations, for example, when there is a disturbance, so that you can have mismanagement going on under the radar for a long time before a drought strikes. And that's when you see, oh gosh, we had a problem. It could also be because of a slow system response, so for the change to be visible. And we also see that in pollution problems. So for example, we're known for a long, long time that endocrine disruptors and persistent organic pollutions such as PFAS has been going on for a long time. And it's been a decade-long knowledge, but we are only now seeing that people actually falling sick. We have a case in Sweden, in Ronneby, where people fell incredibly sick, and it's a lawsuit case and all the repercussions that come with it. But of course, the pollution has been building up for a long time. And the problem with delay is that it makes it hard for policymakers or decision makers to prioritize, because they maybe don't see it. It's not on their daily agenda, so they feel that's something they can wait until later to deal with, even though it's a slow build-up a problem. It also means that it's harder to get awareness. You can talk about it, but it feels abstract to people. And it's harder to gain public support for, especially when investments are costly. So it's incredibly important to educate, to learn about, and to make these invisible, slow changes visible before the actual impact manifests. So that's the first one, the delay. And the second feature I think is important to recognize is a redistribution, so that when we have water cycle changes in one part, that actually alongside the water cycle impact changes elsewhere. We have known effects, of course, like upstream, downstream impacts. So when you have changes of pollution in the upstream river, you see the water pollution or water scarcity in the downstream area. That's well known. But you also have other emergent, because the water cycle connects also thousands of kilometers. So you can have land use change or deforestation in the Amazon that then diminishes the moisture support to the atmosphere, which affects rainfall thousands of kilometers downwind. And these effects are just more newly being recognized in science and not yet in management, I would say. And then, of course, you also have effects within the water cycle that are, another example would be groundwater connection to river and wetlands, that it's a non-linear change. So when you withdraw the groundwater, drop the water table, and breaks the connection to river, you can see permanent changes in wetlands and rivers that are a kind of a redistribution. Impacting groundwater means impacting wetlands. So these kind of connected systems are very important to recognize. This directly leads to the letter I, intertwinement, which refers to what I referred to earlier, the inseparability of water from other systems that have co-evolved with water and therefore are part of the water, land, climate system. So this includes that water problems are not just water problems, but they're also climate problems, land problems, and they're also related to how society organized, because also societies were not detached from how water is. We have adapted and co-evolved already with where rivers are, where there's available water, and adapted how our societies organize. So also the political system, our institutions are inseparable from the water dynamics. And the consequence of the intertwinement is that sometimes we also have feedbacks between systems that are become surprises or paradoxes. In economics, you talk about maybe, for example, Jevons paradox, so which means that the more you increase in efficiency or optimize, you can actually result in not gaining more, even though your efficiency increased, just because the amount of water you use have increased. In more specific in water management context, you can call that as levee effect. So when you build levees and flood protection to protect yourself against floods, societies tend to build closer to the floods and then increase your risk again. It could also be the irrigation paradox, so where you irrigate more in order to when you irrigate and result in when you build more capacity for irrigation, water reservoirs, and it ends up alleviating water scarcity in the short term, but then end up with the long-term water scarcity, because it also attracts industry and societies to follow where there is water. So another word for this is also what we call the maladaptive trap. So you think you're adapting, but it's actually maladaptation that leads to long-term problems. So intertwinement is incredibly important to acknowledge and to deal with. And then the fourth letter, P, relates to permanence, and that's something you mentioned in your introductory talk as well, that we have impacts that are now incredibly hard or actually impossible to reverse within relevant human timescale. Examples of this are plenty. You have some of the most apparent ones are the permanent loss of aquifers, and 70% of groundwater aquifers are facing long-term declines. And a large part of that, a substantial part of that, is also permanent loss because you have subsidence. So once you withdraw the water, you have a sinking of the sediments, of the soils, and you cannot longer use that storage, the porosity for aquifer, even in the future, even if you stop withdrawal and you increase recharge. The global loss of this has been estimated at around 17 cubic kilometers per year, which is an equivalent of 6.8 million of Olympic swimming pools that is permanently destroyed every year. That's a general trend. You also have, this is a permanent loss because you have a subsidence situation. You also have the kind of permanent impact or hard to reverse impact when you are dealing with self-amplifying feedbacks. So it could be, for example, glaciers that are melting, that once they start melting, the water and the darkness of the glaciers then enhances warming and enhances melting, which makes a little bit of a melting glacier accelerate further glacier melt. You also have that similar type of feedback in the Amazon rainforest and the Congo rainforest, because the rainforest also produces its own rain. So when it stops, when the forest is lost, a certain amount of moisture is also lost. And because you reduce precipitation, it makes forest harder to maintain resilience and new forests to grow, which leads to this kind of self-amplifying forest loss and self-amplifying glacier melt. The problem with permanence is also that they are kind of a risk, and they are kind of not properly accounted for. Monica can deal with it later, talk about it later perhaps, but in my perception, the cost of permanence, it's not accounted for when decisions are taken to degrade or when decisions are taken to not protect. It's a very difficult situation with permanence around the world when it comes to water. And the last letter, S, relates to scale. And here again we have two types of scale problems. One is the widespreadness of water cycle changes, and widespreadness of the water risk, but also interconnection with other type of risks. This means that with climate change, we have more variability in the water cycle. So both more drought as well as more floods, and also then with that, in itself, you increase the likelihood of drought happening at the same time, but also combinations of floods and drought happening right after each other. And this kind of compounded events, this kind of combination of extreme events makes it very hard to handle. So say you are a reservoir manager, what do you do if you have a projection of both floods and droughts? Do you release the water or do you keep the water? So it makes it very hard to manage. And then on top of that, you have interacting crises with other types of risk, like for food and for political situation. So the security of food that relies on water is also combined with other type of risks. And this type of interacting crisis that we now see has been termed polycrisis. The second feature of the scale problem is that now feedbacks and dynamics are also happening at that the kind of changes we do also trigger feedbacks and dynamics at a much higher scale, so at, say, the planetary scale. I work with the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which is a framework that identify 9 Earth system processes that are absolutely fundamental for the habitability of Earth, for civilizations to thrive. it takes departure from the fact that agriculture-based civilizations have been possible and only possible the past 12,000 years or so during this Holocene epoch with relatively stable environmental conditions, and we don't have evidence for such civilization to prosper outside such an environmental range. And one of these 9 Earth system processes have been identified as, of course, freshwater, given how critical and vital water is for life. And some years ago, we made an assessment and concluded with the evidence we have in science that the freshwater boundary is likely transgressed because of 2 reasons. One is the widespreadness of the water cycle change, so that we see departures from this Holocene-like baseline at a much larger scale than we have seen before. So more land areas than before, and increasingly are outside the known conditions to our civilizations. So both wetter or drier in terms of soil moisture, as well as stream flow variability. And the second reason we assess it as transgressed is because of the self-amplifying feedbacks that are at a higher level. For example, we see that Amazon rainforest is at the brink of tipping to a treeless or savanna-like state, which would mean a radical loss of carbon. So in principle, we are facing a risk where the large part of the Amazon faces dieback, and due to, among others, drought as well as deforestation and fire. And if that would happen, it would accelerate. So instead of being a carbon sink, it will be releasing carbon. So instead of being our friends, Amazon forest will start releasing emissions instead of taking up the ones that we are emitting, which then will worsen the drought situation both in Amazon as well as the water cycle elsewhere. And you have similar situations in permafrost regions that are now melting quickly, and peatlands that are also holding on to massive amounts of carbon reserves. If you look at the natural systems like permafrost, peatlands, and forest, they together hold on to more carbon than the fossil fuel reserve altogether. So it's a massive amount that we do not want to destabilize. So ultimately, to maintain, to navigate the water resilience globally, we absolutely need to maintain the functions of water for the ecosystems, for the climate system, and foster the capacity of a society to cope, to adapt, and to transform when adaptation is no longer enough. And there are many resilience principles to aid us. It includes fostering diversity and redundancy so that we don't only think of efficiency and optimization, so also accounting for situations where there is a cost of the optimization due to increase in risk and reduction in resilience. It also means acknowledging the slow onset that I talked about, and not only react when impacts manifest, but also act proactively to recognize when slow onsets of mismanagement can lead up to massive impact, such as we will see a couple of years ago in the tragic flooding of Valencia. We also need to recognize and manage connectivity, such as the atmospheric transport across region, and also transboundary rivers are still not well managed, despite decades of work. And also the feedbacks that I already discussed. And it can't be in isolation, can't be in top-down. It needs broad participation. It needs fostering of learning and experimentation as you do when you try to navigate the sea and not trying to drive a car. And it needs also polycentric governance where you can operate across these scales from the local to the global, because that's where these feedbacks and dynamics happen. So I think, and there?
Thank you, Lan. You provided us with, a very complex framework that surrounds our water resources. So you said water is not only water, so water is inherently related to climate, to our ecosystem, to our land. And you have also discussed the complexity of the different relationship between these components of the water system. So in this framework, what I would like now to bring to the table is basically how we can manage this complexity, which is not only the water cycle, but is the water and the nature and the human cycle somehow, in a framework that nowadays is very complex. Like for the governance, we have institutional fragmentation. So water is a global resources, but then we somehow manage it across different boundaries, such as nations, across different actors. And so I would like to ask Monica, what are the current barriers to the system that impede addressing all the issues that Lan mentioned, and what we can do to mobilize public-private finance to help us.
Well, thank you very much, Marta. Thank you also to the Politecnico di Torino for inviting me, and also for your interest into the point of view of the European Investment Bank. I'm going to ask you actually at the beginning, just for my own curiosity, how many of you are familiar with the European Investment Bank? Okay, then maybe I give you a little bit of an intro of who we are. The European Investment Bank is actually your bank. It is a public bank, a multilateral development bank owned by the 27 member states. It's the EU long-term financing arm. So we are your bank. It provides financial support and advisory support worldwide in all sectors based on priorities that are linked with the EU policy priorities. Last year, just to give you an order of magnitude, new financing amounted to 100 billion euros, and we are the largest multilateral financier of the water sector. Last year was about 5 billion of financing, and this is more or less the general yearly amount that the bank is providing in terms of financing for the water sector. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, and it has an arm called the European Investment Fund that focuses on small and medium enterprises financing. Voila. So to go back to today's topic, sorry. I wanted to go back to some of the points that Lan made, and let me know if you don't hear me. I'm trying to speak louder because of the noise. So Lan told us that fostering resilience is like being on a ship at the high seas, and she focused on how complex it is to navigate the high seas. I want to focus on the ship instead. And in fact, when I was thinking about it, I realized that maybe even thinking of us as being on a ship in high seas, it might be over-optimistic, because the ship has one captain, one set of rules, very clear roles, responsibilities. Everybody knows what they have to do when in trouble. And there's a common vision, there's a common goal, there are modalities to adapt to difficult situations, science-based, forward-looking. When I look at our reality when it comes to water resilient stewardships, we're actually on a ship that is made of crews that don't talk to each other, don't talk the same language even. And their decision, very often separate, together generate how the helm is moving and where we're going. So it's a little bit complicated. Nobody's seeing the iceberg, or no, some people are seeing the iceberg. They're even measuring the iceberg. It's just that those measurements are not in the same language that is understood by the crews that are actually making the decisions that move the ship. We are upstairs dancing and drinking. Some people in the lower decks are already experiencing the problems, but we're not listening to them. It's not our problem yet, or we think it's not our problem yet. And we know how the story ends. So that's how I see it, is I'm not particularly optimistic. However, let's return to land and look for some hope, because I think there is some hope. And there are changes that are taking place that may lead us to at least some parts of the ship starting to talk to each other. So, you asked me, Marta, what are the main barriers to financing at scale water resilience? So let me unpack your question, because there's an underlying question first, which is what investment do we need? What do we need to invest in for water resilience? Very often, among water colleagues, and I'm an just water expert, and then I branched out. Very often, the water people tended to talk to the water people. This is no longer the case. This has changed. So the beauty of having a lot of gray hair is that I've seen a little bit of an evolution. What I've seen is an evolution, so this is already a step in the right direction, where the water experts and the water profession has realized the importance of engaging with the other communities. This has been a long process, in fact. It's over the last 20 years at least that I've seen this more and more. And so, what is it that we need to focus on in terms of investment for water resilience? This is the first part of the question. The second point is, what are the barriers to investing and financing water resilience at scale? And then the third point is, if we have time, to also look at some potential solutions. So, with regards to the investment in water resilience, it's not just making sure that first, of course, it's about investing in more resilient water systems and water supply and wastewater management system, water resources management systems, with an increased focus, which we've seen on nature-based solutions, although we can discuss why it's so difficult to look at nature as an asset class. I saw that Professor Boccaletti yesterday was talking about this, yes. So I think it's good. Maybe we can pick up some of his ideas. So with an increased focus on nature-based solution as well as more investment in and uptake of innovation in the water sector. It hasn't been a particularly innovative sector for a number of reasons that we can discuss, but I think this is now moving and changing. The second point, in addition to investing in a more resilient water system, is the investment in agriculture, in industry, in energy systems that reduce their negative impacts on water resilience, their impact on water use. Today is a day where I see there were a lot of talks. I looked at the program, a lot of talks on water and a lot of talks on AI. Well, new data centers, very water givore, whatever we want to call them. So what do we do with the need for cooling and the need for water use of all the new data centers, for instance? So it's a question of understanding how our agriculture, our energy, our industrial system, and their evolution impact water resilience, and what to do about it, and how to invest in a way that reduces that impact. Then there's the other side of the coin, which is investing in making all sectors and in making urban and rural communities more resilient when we look at the other angle, which is the water-related risk that they face, right? So not only they have an impact in terms of potentially negatively affecting water resilience, but they may not become, or they may not be, and in fact many of them are not, water resilient today. So how do we invest? And therein lies the issue, because, and let me anticipate what I think is the crux of the matter, and one of the reasons why we're having difficulties in really making a step change and having a transformational impact in terms of water resilience. the types of decisions and the type of approach from a policy making, so in terms of the political decisions, in terms of how we design our cities, in terms of how we rethink our agricultural systems, have enormous potential, political and socioeconomic implications in terms of doing them. Taking that decision is very difficult. And it's very complex. And our systems, and now we go to the second point, which is why are we not investing more and financing more water resilience in this more complex set way of looking at water resilience? And the first point is governance, right? It's the governance fragmentation that Marta mentioned. It's regulatory shortcomings and, let's say, an incomplete regulatory system, both at national and local, and also in terms of international agreements and instruments, and institutional fragmentation. The water sector is known for OECD DOCET, its multi-level governance nature. When you work on multi-level governance level, it's a mess, not to mince words. So what we have is that to really address water resilience is, to paraphrase the EU water resilience strategy, is source to sea by nature. But source to sea, you're crossing many boundaries, you're crossing many sectors, you're crossing, so this is where we have a difficulty, because both the policy making and also then the implementation of these policies and strategies requires the coordination of many actors, not just in terms of the administrative levels, public, but also utilities, but also farmers, but also cities and citizens, because in the end also the choices of citizens do matter in this sense. This is very important, I think, and for instance, it's also very much the case when we look at the situation of the water sector in Italy. Very interesting analysis in the latest Libro Bianco Valore Acqua 2026 that really looks at fragmented management, slow authorization procedures, and how these then translate in delayed investment and higher costs. So, you know, it's closer to home. It hits us really, really close to home. The second point is that the funding model, our financial systems, and then the way in which the water sector, if we stick just with the water sector, is funded, is very often misaligned with a focus on resilience. What we have is that political sensitivity of the water sector, where affordability matters a lot, where investments, whenever they have to be carried out, very often have a big impact on citizens, because it's about opening roads and delays and the works and the noise and the smell and all of that. And the issue is that then also from a financing perspective, the water sector, and to paraphrase the OECD, its funding and financing is based on basically three things, right? It's based on tariffs, and here we know how political the setting of tariffs can be, because there are sometimes a misperception that because water is a public good, it should be free, but we all know that what implication that could have. Tariffs, taxes, and transfers from abroad, from the EU and, you know, and other sources of grants. That's the bedrock. And if you need that to get that right in order to be able then to attract additional financing. And very often that is not in a very good state. And I'm just talking about the water service provision. When you look at water resources management, the situation is even more dire, right? Apart from, I'm clearly, you know, speaking as if the situation were the same everywhere. It isn't. But in general speaking, this is even more of an issue. And as I was saying earlier, in water resources management, with the importance also, when we look at water resilience, of embedding, of incorporating nature-based solution, we've seen that indeed nature is only recently becoming recognized as an asset class and a structure to finance nature-based solutions that include payments for ecosystem services and other types of solutions, have encountered difficulties in the past. I'm thinking, you know, about 10 years ago at the EIB, we had set up with EU funding a natural capital financing facility. We were a little bit ahead of our time. There wasn't a lot of uptake, but it was good in terms of showing some pilots and the fundamental point there was, can we find a way to make sure that we identify the benefits of investing in nature so that we can identify some non-fiscal modalities to finance nature-based solutions, so that we can federate the beneficiaries, including private sector, to be able to get some money out of them to fund fundamental nature-based solutions. It was a bit ahead of our time. I think now the time is much riper for this type of setup. I know, for instance, again, thinking of Professor Boccaletti, the idea of the water funds, etc. But again, they remain very often pilots. You don't see yet that scale up that we would like to see. The third point is about, and again, it's why is the financial system and the way in which we finance not aligned with water resilience? It's because water-related risks are not yet fully reflected in our financial risk assessment frameworks, right? Lan has already talked about the fact that we're no longer living in a predictable environment, and the persistence of the delayed and persistent nature of impacts doesn't make it easy to assess risks that then are translatable from a financial perspective. And yet, I think that also in part thanks to what happened over the last 10 years in the climate space, after Mark Carney, and again, my gray hair, 2015, Mark Carney, current Prime Minister of Canada, then the Governor of the Bank of England, made a speech. Although it sounds like a boring speech to Lloyd's and to the insurance community, it was a seminal speech, because it's called the Speech on the Tragedy of the Horizon. I don't know if you've read it. I would warmly suggest that you read it. And it talks about the mismatch in the time horizon that we should have in terms of planning, in terms of really being forward-looking, going back to the ship, that forward-looking capacity of saying, I need to focus on the long term and the really, really short term, not just of the political cycle, but even shorter one of financiers and looking for financial returns. The Tragedy of the Horizon was a fundamental speech because it really triggered also what happened at COP21 in Paris that year. And it gave us a sense of the mismatch between what we should be doing and the way in which we think. And until we change that, I'm not going to say anything else. But this changed. This changed a lot. In 2015, there was a creation, because he was also, at the time, the chairman of the G20 Financial Stability Board. And they created this task force, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Sounds technical, boring. It created guidance and then de facto requirements for banks and for companies to assess and report on their climate-related risks. Once you understand your risk, you change the way you do things. And the reason for that, why did the Financial Stability Board do that? Because they understood that climate risk was a systemic risk, was a financial system potential disruptor, was a macroeconomic risk. It's an issue for our countries from a financial sustainability perspective. Once you get that, that's the deus ex machina that needs to come in from where you don't expect it sometimes, the Financial Stability Board, that speech at Lloyd's. And that changes everything in the way in which we look at climate risk and the way in which we plan and the way in which we finance. Why is it relevant for water? For two reasons. First, because physical risk, climate physical risk, which is one of the three key elements that the TCFD, this task force, looked at and that now we are reporting on, is largely water risk. And because it also gave rise to a new task force and a new set of requirements on nature-related requirements for nature-related risk disclosure requirements, the TNFD, nature. and that one has a lot of water-related elements in it. So I think that, you know, there are these moments where something changes, and you can hope. And I think I said at an event many, many years ago, and at a climate event, that, you know, our credit risk people would save the world. And I never thought I would say something like that, but indeed, once you start measuring risk, when it starts hitting you in the pocket, you make different decisions. And this is, if I go back to my point on investment, on when we look at water resilience, making sure that we also look at the water-related risk for our systems, for all of our sectors, for our, you know, cities, and we start planning differently, that's what I'm talking about. Final point on barriers. Too many projects are not investment ready. This is the basics. We talk a lot about this, but in the end, very often, when we want to, and here the we is we financing financial people, when we want to finance projects, they're not ready. Their quality is not there. They're not investable. They're not financeable. And, or they're too small for going to scale. And we need to find ways to aggregate. We need to find aggregators to be able to finance at scale. So, fortunately, there are solutions. I'm going to touch on just a few because I'm running wildly out of time. And, yeah. So, with regards to the solutions, first, one key solution to unlock more investment and financing is outside the investment and financing space. It's about governance, again. Governance, making sure that we have better regulation, that we have better strategies is fundamental. I think a beacon of hope at the moment in the EU Water Resilience Strategy, and especially the fact that we are now starting to look not at the water resilience strategy, but at a set of policy instruments that are starting to talk to each other quite a bit at EU level. So there's, sometimes the EU gets it almost right. We have the EU Water Resilience Strategy, together with a revamped set of, I mean, what we call the water acquis, which are the various directives about drinking water quality, about wastewater quality, that are starting to take into consideration many more risks to citizens, and different ways of having polluter pay, for instance. These are linked also with the adaptation strategy, and importantly, with the EU Preparedness Union strategy. This sounds dry. What is it? What is the EU Preparedness Union strategy? Especially, please go look it up. It is an instrument that is about the systemic risk that the EU is facing. It's about looking at the way in which our societies are or are not prepared to a number of risks, and water is included in there. And it links also with the geopolitical situation and with security. It's a very complex, but you know, we start thinking systemically. And what's interesting is also that, therefore, when we start talking about water, now we talk about water and security. We talk about water infrastructure as critical infrastructure. We talk about water in the context of water and competitiveness. Water as a key element, and water resilience as a key element of EU competitiveness. And because we realize that the lack thereof, the lack of availability, can have an enormous impact on our productive sectors. And conversely, because Europe has been, you know, I think we have about 40% of all the patents in terms of new innovation in the water sector. It's a potential area of growth. So, governance. Then, secondly, I would say, let me just go quickly. Let me just think about which one I can mention, because there are too many. Yeah, let me just two. First, three. One is, very briefly, one is, as I was saying, aggregating, you know, making sure very often our investment in water is done at very local level. You have small utilities, let's think of Italy, small utilities. An example of an aggregator and also an innovative financial solution. It's called the hydro bond. In Veneto, EIB has set up, and we've now done the 6th issuance and invested in these hydro bonds for smaller utilities so that we can aggregate at a sufficiently large level that we can invest in it, and we've worked on finding the appropriate way to provide guarantees for this. The second point is, I just said it, risk sharing and guarantees. The third that I wanted to mention is the provision of integrated advisory support together with financing, making sure they provide the technical assistance to prepare the projects, to give the capacity building to the different counterparts, and this is something that can be done and should be done. And finally, not to forget the fact that we should be focusing not just on investment that reduces risk and financing tools to finance preparedness, to finance risk reduction, water-related risk reduction, water resilience at large. There are new instruments, they're not that new anymore, but there are instruments for risk transfer. And these need to be part of the solution. Insurance, reinsurance, catastrophe bonds, and other type of instruments. And we're looking at that, for instance, how can we protect farmers? How can we provide insurance and reinsurance for the agriculture sector? And we're extending that into the water sector. So these are some elements of a solution. There are many more, but I can never stop talking about water when you get me started. So
thank you, Monica. This is great. Actually, we have collected so many elements that allows us to better understand the water cycle. Overall, it seems like you're bringing us back to, I don't know, I can see a final advice, trying to behave like water in the sense of the fact that water functions, somehow the water cycle function on a global scale, so water is renewable and sustainable on a global scale, so putting together all the different pieces we have analyzed can help us in addressing the current water bankruptcy. So we have a few minutes maybe for a question or two from the audience, if any maybe doubts or requests for our speaker. Feel free to intervene. Please, we have a microphone.
Can you hear me? Okay. I was wondering, is there a country worldwide or maybe a region that is dealing better with this water resilience problem, or they're just doing what they can?
Maybe a quick comment. So I think there are many good examples. I don't know if necessarily we need to go country scale, but at least at local scale, I think we have a great example, for example, in the municipality of Scatasta in southern Sweden. It's a region that has been very flood prone for decades. It's a couple of meters below sea level. And they have both invested in technological solutions like barriers against the flooding, but also invested heavily in the wetland system. So now it's an UNESCO biosphere reserve, and the whole process is ongoing and decades long and involve broad participation and together with local farmers. But it's also one of these cases that has been a pilot for both scientific research as well as where they received funding from international level as well as from national level. So it needs to be scaled up, but I think it shares many learning experiences. And you see also across Europe there are barriers that are in river systems. There's 1 million barriers in river systems in Europe, and many of them are obsolete. And it's very hard to remove them. There are great examples where you succeeded, but there are also legislation, regulation that needs to be changed to scale up this kind of effort. So I'm not sure if I need to mention a specific country, but there are many opportunities for scaling up these kind of initiatives.
No, absolutely. And again, I don't want to single out countries also because, we have constituencies, I have to be careful. But let me give you a couple of examples. as Lan was saying, the focus really of providing room for water, right? This is a fundamental discussion that has been going on for a while. Room for river in the context of the definition of flood risk management solution, not just gray, but green solutions, and especially making sure that we have room for river when you look at the basin level, and then also, you know, making cities, you know, the famous sponge cities focused, right? And so I think, for instance, Copenhagen, when it was hit really hard, when was it? Back in the 2010s, I think it was 2011 or something like that. After that, really went into a big push for enhancing the permeability. And this is really a push that we are now, for instance, having in our dialogue with our city counterparts on how do we make sure that we enhance the permeability of the soil, how do we design cities that can accommodate very different regimes in terms of hydraulic regimes going forward. The issue is that even that gets you up to a point. If the Thwaites Glacier gives way, if the AMOC goes bye-bye in the next decade, as some say, at some point we'll have to deal with very, very different types of realities. And that's where we go back to the very difficult decisions that have to be made. So there are many examples of this. We can, you know, give you some specific ones later on if you want.
Do we have maybe another quick question? Yes, please.
Okay, I'm not an expert in water, first of all, but it's just a curiosity. Since you all belong to the European community, did you ever worked out a sort of statistic about gross national use of water and per capita and compare the different countries in Europe? I know that the availability of water is different, and also agriculture and industry are different from country to country, but we all belong to the same community. And so I would be curious knowing about, is there some connection to gross national product per capita or any other interesting feature that can come out of such a statistic? That's all.
I'll go first, so you give, yeah. Okay, with regards, I don't have them in my brain, so sorry, I just cannot give you the comparisons, but they exist. So there are statistics with regards to per capita use and also per euro of GDP of water intensity, right? I can find them. If you give me a card or a connection, I can then send you the link of the statistics, but the EU in the context also of I think in the reports relate to the Water Framework Directive, even though the Water Framework Directive is mainly about water quality, but I think they have it in there. And EEA has them at EU and EFTA level, I think. So I will find them and I can send them to you. But yes, they exist. The question is that when you look at this at national level, it masks a lot of disparities then region to region. And what is also interesting, apart from the statistics about water use, are the statistics about water losses. You know, the statistics in Italy are disconcerting in terms of the percentage. I think the average is around 40%, and we have peaks in the south of Italy where we shouldn't, of over 50, 60%. So you need to look at a cohort of data points, and especially also regionalize them to get a full overview of where and how to intervene. That's why also for investment, whilst the global picture is fundamental, and I think this is also a concept that probably Professor Bocaletti also used, but a place-based approach is fundamental, right? We need to respond to the specific challenges in terms of availability, pollution, uses, and dynamics of the system, of the productive, demographic, territorial system to address the issue.
Yeah, I think Monica responded to the question. I also don't have the numbers in my head, so apologies for that. But maybe just to take the opportunity to comment a little bit of the numbers. And I think, like looking at the numbers, measuring, science has made terrific advances in accounting for risk and numbers, and we see that more and more. Also in the recent World Bank rebootment development report, they account for the cost of deforestation, for example, on crop failure loss, which is, to me, it's revolutionary in a way that World Bank is doing this kind of work. We're making tremendous advances, but also that maybe just a careful note, coming back to what I said earlier, so that maybe we should also be careful to not get stuck in maladaptation, so that when we do these measurements and efficiency, it's great and it's absolutely fundamental and basic, but it's not going to be enough to also look at a strategic level. So when we have the EU water resilience strategy to do it in a strategic way. And maybe also just referring to the Water Framework Directive, that we see a recent suggestions to weaken it, which is kind of a surprise in a time where the EU is suggesting to strengthen it through the water resilience strategy. So also doing the strategies is not enough, but also to see that the visions and the strategies end up in real changes. So you could question, why is the Water Framework Directive proposed to be weakened instead of investing in technology to improve the treatment of water? Why are we trying to make life easier for mining companies by polluting water instead of investing in technology? So yeah,
we live in interesting times. Can I rebound on that? Because I think this is a moment for enormous reflection. Again, the gray hair moment. We lived 2015, and all of a sudden, at that time, we thought the world was going in a certain direction. We had Paris Agreement, we had the Sendai Framework, we had the SDGs, le magnifiche sorti progressive of Leopardian memory. So, where are we today? In a completely different world, and we had the Green Deal in the previous van der Leyen Commission. We are in a different moment, and this goes back to making hard decision is hard. Keeping the eye on the ball of the long term, on what needs to be done in the long term is difficult. When there are geopolitical dynamics that give us a threat that feels a lot closer to home, but may not be. If we look at the number of deaths of heat waves, the number of deaths related to and cost of natural disaster, of water-related disasters, they're enormous. How many deaths have we had in Europe for what they're telling us we need to prepare for? Okay, but maybe we need to prepare for it because it's a cliff and we don't want to fall off the cliff. So we see how easy it is to go off course. And the wording today is not to weaken, it's simplification. And the word of the day is simplification with regards to regulation, but because we've gold-plated, we have to admit that we've gold-plated a little bit. Another important piece of work at European level in terms of coming with a common language for investment and financing has been the taxonomy. I don't know if any of you, there was a taxonomy, a list fundamentally of key investment for enhancing sustainability, for climate action, for climate mitigation, adaptation, linked with, to avoid maladaptation, a do no significant harm set of principles on how to not negatively affect other environmental objectives. It started with the best of intentions. We were part of that discussion. It became a little bit complex, and then there's a backlash. We have very often the swing of the pendulum. We go in one direction and we think everything is going well. We sometimes overcomplicate it a little bit. Then there's a pushback for simplification, but then this pushback goes the other way, and we go for oversimplification. So it's going to be interesting to see where we land, but we live in, unfortunately, for all of us, we live in interesting times.
Thank you, Monica, for actually bringing us to the key point of our discussion today, that we are living in a different moment for water resources. So we mentioned at the beginning these water bankruptcies that I think after all you brought on our tables from the water resilience perspective and what science is doing, what science can do, and what the finance and the infrastructure investment can do. Maybe this can also offer a window of opportunity to tackle these bankruptcies. And yeah, I would like to conclude remarking the fact that, okay, we are living in a moment which is very complicated, very difficult, where some multilateralism is getting back somehow, but let's remember that water remains like a resource that is uniquely shared. Okay, so when we think about it, as Lan mentioned, it is a complex system with multiple components, but we have to think about it in water terms, as Monica reminded us, to find a way to put together the different systems, the financial system, the investments, so that we can maybe find solutions, such as in the nature-based solution, for example, so seeing nature as our infrastructure to cope with the water cycle and address this bankruptcy. So thank you, everyone. We are a little bit late. Thank you, our guests.